released a statement in the last half an hour or so confirming that 9-point deduction and the fact that the deduction will be effective immediately, meaning that Birmingham will drop down the table, as you say, and potentially now face a relegation battle from the Championship this season. There was a hearing on Monday. It was a three-person panel that sat in London. One was an independent chairman, and then the others were representations, one from the EFL and one from Birmingham City. And Birmingham actually pleaded guilty in that hearing on Monday, and the independent chairman has now handed down a 9-point deduction as punishment. The EFL, in their statement, call that punishment appropriate, although both parties do have now 14 days in which to appeal. These EFL profitability and sustainability rules were brought in 2016-17. They were to measure the accounts of clubs for the period of 3 years. And that first window where the EFL could measure those accounts ended in 2018. Now, a year before that, in 2017, it was looking very likely that Birmingham were going to go over the £39 million loss limit set out in those rules by the EFL. And then a year later, it transpired that Birmingham did, in fact, pass those loss limits by almost £10 million. This has been hanging over Birmingham City since the start of the season. The EFL wrote to them in August of last year, notifying them that they would be subject to an independent commission hearing, which means that week after week, Gary Monk has been setting out his side with the knowledge that potentially their league table position is actually a false one because there was a points deduction hanging over them.
Well, you mentioned a points deduction hanging over them. It was widely expected it was going to be a 12-point deduction. So is there a feeling of slight relief?
I think there is a sense of relief here at the club and, in fact, amongst the supporters as well. Birmingham, as I said earlier, were warned in 2017 that they were potentially likely to breach those profitability and sustainability rules, and that was one of the aggravating factors that the EFL brought to the hearing on Monday, the fact that Birmingham were warned and continued to spend in the January transfer window of 2017 and the summer transfer window of 2017 as well. There was also aggravating factors with regards to not adequate plans put in place by Birmingham to bring themselves back into line with those profitability and sustainability rules once they were warned by the EFL. And a third aggravating factor was looked at the signing of Christian Pedersen, who was brought in by Birmingham despite being under a transfer embargo. It was registered by the EFL, but there were question marks over whether that should have been allowed. In terms of mitigation, Birmingham put forward that they had entered an early guilty plea and that it was their first offence. But as I say, the EFL this afternoon declaring that they see this 9-point deduction as appropriate. What happens now? Well, we understand that Birmingham will be under what's called a soft business plan, and which will then be watched by the EFL, and they will have a look at Birmingham's accounts, and their information will be shared with the EFL to make sure that they are bringing themselves back into line with those profitability and sustainability rules going forward. It does mean, though, that now Birmingham can enter into contract discussions with certain players, someone like their captain, Michael Morrison, who's out of contract in the summer. Birmingham now can begin those discussions in terms of offering him a new contract, because we understand they won't be under a transfer embargo going forward. It doesn't actually completely put Birmingham in the clear what's happened today, because that 3-year window will come round again next year, and if the EFL take a look at their accounts this time next year in 2019 and find again that they have broken that loss limit of £39 million, we could well be in this same position again.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you. Well, before the 9-point deduction, Gary Monk's side were 13th, 14 points clear of the bottom three, but this is how it looks after that 9-point deduction. They dropped 5 places to 18th, and perhaps more crucially, are now just 5 points above Rotherham in the final relegation place. Former Birmingham manager Gary Rowett says the problem is the increase in the wage bill, which he claims has trebled since he left the club in 2016.
My initial reaction was that at least it wasn't 12 points, because obviously that's a sort of figure that has been bandied around in the media for quite some time now, and I think that 9 points just, at the very, very least, gives them a little bit of a buffer from that bottom three, because course, that's your main concern now, like the last two previous seasons in danger of a relegation battle. When I saw some of those figures, because they've been quite public, since we were there, I think the playing budget trebled in, probably a year, which is just incredible, really. I think there's two things to it. I think one goes to show that, the money doesn't necessarily buy you a miles better player in the division if you don't get your recruitment right. And the second thing is that everybody is so desperate. I mean, we've got to understand these are owners coming into a new club wanting desperately to get in the Premier League, which is probably the reason they bought the club in the first place. And you have to say sometimes, and I'm not suggesting that people are blameless, but sometimes I think it tends to be the people advising the owners that, rather than the owners themselves. I think their reasons for buying the club are true, that they want to get success and they want to try to get the club where everybody wants to be, and the fans